Well, I've got a few of these cameras here that need to be serviced. This is an early example, and one of the odd things about this is the film advance doesn't want to drop back to the rest position properly. It sticks out like that, and in that position you can't depress the shutter release. Knock that back to the rest position and you can fire the shutter. So it's certainly got some problem in there. This is a fairly early example, shows all the characteristics of the early one I showed before. This one, the shutter has not been serviced, that lens is very grimy, but we're not interested in the shutter, we're interested in the camera body. So let's have the shutter out and start servicing the camera body. So I'll take my lens spanner, that was certainly not tight, which doesn't overly surprise me. We're still clinging on by a thread here, are we? Yeah, just about. Okay, that's the shutter off the body. The early type, pop its lens and shutter assembly to one side. Let's have a look at the camera body. So, what things should we note about this? Being the early type, it has no flash contact on the mount. It has the aperture scale on the front plate. At the top of the camera, the frame counter disc is easily knocked with your thumb. The later cameras, that chrome disc was wider, which protected it. It had a notch here so that you could adjust it. Okay, let's take the top off the camera. Open the back of the camera. Something through the fork of the rewind to stop it turning. The rewind knob simply unscrews with your fingers. No drama, no special tools required. This one I can see the back is reluctant to clip into place. Probably means there's a little bit of corrosion or something in here. That's bright now. So the top cover. 2 screws at the rewind end. They're chrome plated brass, easily marked, so be careful. 1 screw at the end of the top plate. Lift off the top cover carefully. Alright, here's our top cover. Let's have a quick look at that. The top of these cameras looks vaguely like a Retina 1B. Different in the viewfinder. The viewfinder, as you can see here, consists plain piece of glass here with the lens at the front, held back with this little bracket, and the lens at the back here. That's all there is. There's nothing in between. There's no bright lines or anything of that nature. This all looks a little bit suspicious. I don't know whether it's got glue on there or what it's got. Anyway, we can put that to one side. Bit rattly this one, that glass is loose in there. This bracket needs to be moved forward. The frame counter, you can see this piece here. This moves the frame counter forwards in this shuffling action with the film advance. And if you hold this with your finger, you can rotate this quite easily. If you don't hold it with your finger and then you rotate this round in that direction, this spring will jam in under the housing, and then you might find that it's difficult to turn this because you'll be chewing off the tops of these little plastic projections on that disc. So don't play with the frame finder while it's off the camera if you want it to live. film release button. It has a small return spring on it. And here's our film release button. The film release button sits in this position and the tip of it bears on the film release shaft here. Okay, let's have a look at our shutter release here. Well, we've got the shutter button on the top, that can come off. Lift that off carefully. I think there's a spring under this. I'll hold the camera upside down and see if the spring will come out on the top of the shaft. Yes, it does. There's the return spring. Now this one has been glued in place at the top by the looks of it. That might be dried grease, but it does look a little bit suspiciously like glue or wax to stop that spring getting away. The camera body itself, what have we got here? Okay, so if you move the film advance, swing the film advance, you can see that this top piece, those prongs there at the top move. They would act against these tabs and advance the frame counter. That ding noise in the background would have been our retaining ring falling out, which I can take out of the back of the camera. And let's have a look at this. Now that screw there, that is a different arrangement than on later models. Everything else looks pretty similar to me. So let me bring in a later body and we'll see how that's arranged. This one of the later examples, as you can tell by the flash contact there and the chrome front on the shutter. Let's open this up and have a look. So rewind knob off in the same way. 2 screws here. One screw at the end of the top housing here. This chrome disc is larger. It's not so easy to accidentally knock the frame counter. There's a cutout in the chrome disc on this side to allow you to adjust the counter. Lift the top off carefully as before. Everything else looks much the same inside here. Our film release button and its return spring look much the same. Let's have a look at the shape of those. Okay, there's a distinct difference there. This one, the tip's turned down. Whether that's how it should have been or whether somebody has adjusted it with a pair of pliers, I don't know. This one is virtually flat. Back to the camera body, we can lift off the shutter release button. That looks the same. Let's lift out the shutter release shaft, hopefully with its spring. Yep, it's come out with its spring. And that's grease. Grease is sticking that spring in place. So quite possibly the gunk that looked like it could possibly be glue was grease there too. But let's have a look at the top of the camera. The early example. Our coupling here has a screw head visible. The later example, no such thing. This bar turns down and the end of it passes into the little cocking bracket under there. So there's a difference there. I'm having a look at these two cameras to see if I spot anything else that's different. Of course, this is the later camera, has the chrome trim on the camera body edges, and this is just a black lacquered edges. There's certainly a difference in the casting here. These castings were common with the Retina 3C type cameras, hence this slot in the back where you'd have had a cocking rack on a Retina 3C camera. Okay, so mechanically I'm not seeing many differences apart from this and the obvious difference in the casting. Let's find the mid times, the camera that came from the intermediate production, and we'll see what that looked like. That's this camera here. On this camera we have the light value shutter, but it's all in black, not chrome. We have the small chrome disc here so that the rim of the counter is exposed, like on the earlier camera. Let's find out what this is like in the top. Off with its rewind. Out with the two screws. Lift that top cover off carefully, recover that screw that's trying to hide. So here's the film release button. Let's have a look at that. It closely resembles the one from the later camera and doesn't have the tip bent down like that early example. The shutter release, same deal, shutter release button, we'll lift that off. Pull out the shutter release shaft. Again, that's a bit sticky with grease, but very much the same as both of those other cameras. But what's our film advance mechanism like? Right, here's the early camera. Here's the mid-time production job, and you can see that they both share the same characteristic of a screw visible here. Now there's obviously some play in there, some movement at that position. There's a slot in this black thing here which allows some lost motion, if you like. The body castings are the same here in both cases. So they appear to have used the same body casting in the mid-production with its light value shutter. Different front plate, of course, because the front plate is very much the same as the front plate on the late cameras. Okay, so that's interesting. So we've got our mid-range example. I'll put that to one side. We'll concentrate on our two extreme different cameras, if you like. To dismantle the film advance. Well, we don't have a cocking rack, of course, or a gear on the top of that shaft that couples to the cocking rack. But otherwise, this mechanism is very similar to that on a Retina 3C folder. I'll unscrew this screw here, and we can probably unscrew that one. Take off the strap lug here and start taking apart the film advance components. I expect them to be quite similar apart from this business. Okay, so we'll start with that screw. The screwdriver I'm using there has got the tip cut away to leave 2 points, or 2 rectangles in this case, to engage with those screws. Pop that to one side, lift this off the top. Okay, will that swing out of our way? Yeah, it sort of will. So underneath that we had the washer. much as you'd have on a 3C type camera. Let's just remove this strap plug to make it easier to access everything. It helps be flung away, fortunately landing in its park position where the pieces were being piled up. Okay, so lift off these pieces. These pieces are pretty much identical to the film advance on the 3C type cameras. The grease here is quite sticky, dried out, probably hasn't had any attention in a very long time. The gear should lift off. Yeah, it's a bit sticky. That's better. Okay, so what have we got here? One screw here holds this little pawl in place in its return spring, and that also holds this whole bush for the film advance in place on the body, and that's quite tight. So there's the screw with the return spring. There is the pawl that stops the film advance from backing up, and there's the spacer that sits underneath that pawl, and if you put that spacer in upside down you have a hard time of it. We've got one screw over here. On a Retina 3C type camera, that's where you would have that big shoulder screw that supports the cocking rack. Of course we don't have a cocking rack, so there's no need for that. Okay, well we can do no more there until we get into the bottom of the camera. So, start here by removing the Leatherette patch on the film advance lever, which I normally do with a scalpel. I would say that's been serviced before, just judging from the look of that adhesive. We want the leatherette off the base of the camera, so we need to take the back catch cover and tripod sockets around off. Those screws are very small. They're brass, chromed brass, and they mark easily. Lift this cover off, and here is the back catch cover lever and its return spring. Be careful not to lose that return spring. So back to here. 3 screws hold the film advance lever in place. The film advance lever is the same as that on a Retina 3C camera of the era. Right, the leatherette. Again, I'll use my scalpel. That adhesive is quite gummy. It means that it's probably not the original adhesive, and I have reason to suspect that if I apply a little bit of naphtha here, that adhesive will soften. Here, and we can get the leatherette off in one piece. Right, let me just prop this camera body up a bit. I just want to run a little bit of naphtha underneath that leatherette. Sometimes you can do that by putting a drop on your scalpel like that. That adhesive is quite gummy. It's reasonably flexible. The leatherette looks very old and brittle by comparison. So I've got to be quite careful. I cannot just peel the leatherettes up. They will just turn to little pieces. Now this is naphtha. It's not a good thing to put on leatherettes, but it's a matter of lesser evils really. Better to get the leatherette off all in one piece and a little bit dull looking than off in tiny pieces and having to be replaced. Yeah, that's a bit reluctant to come out. So I'll just pop the camera body up on something here. The leatherette, I can see cracks running down the length of it. And you might be wondering why I take so much care and attention for a bit of leatherette. Well, replacing leatherettes with originals is exceptionally difficult because it's uncommon to find new old stock leatherettes for cameras that are over 60 years old. And even if you do encounter new old stock leatherettes for cameras that are 60 years old, the chance that they are really the same shape is not high. Typically, they'll have shrunken, dried out and shrunken over time. And that might not be a big issue across the width of a moulding like this, but from one end of the camera to the other, you can find that when you get it over the rewind button, it will not stretch to go over the back release button, and vice versa. In some cases you have to get creative, which might mean that you're using two pieces of leatherette, and you make one fit here and then you cut the other one back to fit it. Looking under here, whenever this leatherette was glued back on, removed and glued back on previously, no effort was made to remove the old adhesive, and so it's quite lumpy under here. This is a camera body with black painted edges or black lacquered edges, and the adhesive sticks very well to the bare aluminium body casting, much more so than it would do to the chromed brass trim plates that were used on later cameras. So a camera like this is harder to get the leatherettes off in one piece, and these leatherettes, as I've said, are not in good condition. There's a lot of cracks on them. And there's certainly, the leatherette has probably been glued on twice before, and the camera has certainly had leatherettes glued to it probably twice or more times. So it's possible that the original leatherette was replaced and that this is the second lot of leatherettes. But if they'd been replaced, you know, I'd have expected more work done to clean that surface up. Okay, so there's our leatherette off in one piece. There's a fair bit of adhesive on the back of it. Here's the camera body. So we've got our tripod socket at this end. Now those screws are quite commonly loose. Let's just check these ones. They're not loose, okay. At this end, we've got 3 screws here. Hold that cover in place. Now that leatherette was a bit lumpy and bumpy. It wasn't a terrible example by any means. But I expect that once I clean this base of the camera up and clean the back of the leatherette up, I'll be able to get it to stick down quite flat. Okay, so we can take the cover plate off. Here's our Film Advance shaft here. This is our rewind button, which we need to deal with next. Now I've got a pair of modified pliers that'll work really well on that button. But there are other ways.